Walking down the basement with this police officer, I did my best to act as naturally as I could. You know, with strings being constantly tied to me. She was obviously uncomfortable with me, but if she's a cop she most likely knows about King Creole. If that one time that cop tried to arrest the two of us is any indication, then the whole police force knows what goes on in here. I finally made it down the steps with her in tow, watching as Creole was beating Mary with his cane for probably the same reason he had been before. "Sir, this officer has a wish," I said, for once in my normal voice. He must have been so upset that he wasn't even bothering to control me at that moment. He looked up at me with a scowl on his face, before staring at the officer. His button eyes went from her to me, then down to Mary, whose face was barely held together from his vicious beatings. "Ah, Officer Kilpatrick. You're early. Our appointment wasn't until 7. He chuckled, taking his top hat off and running his fingers through his black messy hair. Putting the item back on and walking closer to us. Pointing his thumb back at Mary and moving his head towards her. The sign for me to move Mary out of sight. Nodding, I went over and gently picked Mary up. She's light as a feather, mostly since her body is hollow on the inside, I'm pretty sure. And I carefully placed her in the corner of the room. Careful not to put her down too hard and risk more pieces of her falling off. I know, but I got off early so I figured I might as well just come here. She crossed her arms and looked at the Voodoo shop owner. We had a deal. I made sure that your missing clerk wouldn't be investigated thoroughly. Now you owe me a wish, she said, her eyes traveling to see me staring back at her. That couldn't be possible, I thought to myself. Creole had that much influence that no one was ever going to come looking for me. This officer had been my one chance at getting out of this hell. But it turned out she had signed my eternal damnation here. Yes, dear. I'm well aware of our little deal. Creole chuckled, brushing some porcelain off his suit and staring at the middle-aged officer in front of him. You want your precious little daughter back? He sighed, looking at her with his back to me. She kept looking over at me, tending to Mary and obviously feeling guilty about what she'd done. You can do that, right? And not have her ending up like a freak like you two? She asked, pointing to the two of us and waiting for an answer. Gonna be honest, that one hurt. Being compared with Creole really hurt what's left of my soul. If I still do have a soul. If that's what you wish. But that is particularly hard to do. And for that, I'm going to need her body. Creole explained, walking past her and over to the basement stairs. And I'll need your help with that, Officer Kilpatrick, he said with a toothy grin. Those stitches strained to breaking once again. Why can't you send your little puppet? She snuffed, pointing to me again and once again chipping away at my soul and causing me to turn my gaze away from them and look back at Mary, who patted my chest to make me feel a little better. I'm afraid Travis isn't allowed outside of the shop. I will accompany you if you so wish. Her body must be brought back here, of course. Otherwise, I'm unable to perform the required ritual to bring her back, Creole explained, tapping his fingers on his cane. Clearly waiting for this woman to get a move on things. Fine, she said with a long sigh. Walking past him and up the stairs, Creole turned his button eyes back at me and I felt the strings pull tight as I was forced to stand up straight once more. Travis, dear, be a good boy and close up shop. I'll be back within the hour, he ordered of me, leaving before I could give him any kind of stupid ass kissing response. I sighed as I was allowed to go limp again, waiting until I heard the front door open and close before I turned back to Mary. You've got a chance to look for a way out now, she said, picking up some of her pieces and starting to put some of the pieces on them, sighing as she got a good amount of her face back into a decent shape. Is there going to be any way out of here? I asked her, raising a brow at her. I got a shrug back and a look like I was an idiot. I haven't left this basement in almost 95 years. How should I know? She rolled her one eye. Damn. She got me. Pouting a bit as I turned to go upstairs, I looked back at her and smiled. She may be older than everyone I know combined, but all girls still has some bite in her. Making my way back upstairs, I did my only order and locked up the shop. Looking around at the dusty and cobweb-filled place with my button eyes and trying to find any kind of way out of her. That wasn't leaving the front door. Once again I had no luck. Turning my head, I looked at the voodoo dolls on the wall and thought for a second. Any of you guys want to help me out of here? I asked them, getting silence back from them. Well, it was worth an ask. I looked back over at the boss man's office and resigned myself to try and look in there for anything that could help me out here. Opening up his desk again, I once again couldn't find anything useful. How does he not have any scissors? How the hell does he cut shit? Resigning again, I sat in his office chair and looked around at all the pictures. Picking up one of the pictures on his desk and looking at it. It was old and weathered, but I could see that it was Charles and his mother. Made sense that this was the only picture of himself that he hadn't destroyed. He really must have loved his mother. I miss mine so much. Setting the picture down, I sighed and rubbed my face. My fingers going down and scratching the stitches on my neck. Something deep down in me wanted to rip off the stitches. Would that kill me? Since the fact that I wasn't able to just do it and that invisible force was keeping me from doing it, I think that it might. Well, if I'm ever able to get to fight Creole in a fist fight, I know where to go for. They were gone for a good while, and when they finally came back to the shop, I was out of the office and standing at the counter like I usually do. Creole walked through after opening the door that I locked and holding the door open as Officer Kilpatrick brought her daughter's casket into the shop. Dirt dripping onto the floor and causing me to exhale through my nose in annoyance. I'd probably have to clean that. Travis, be a good boy and help Mrs. Kirkpatrick with her luggage, Creole ordered. I nodded and walked over, holding one end of it and helping her as we both were led down the basement. Getting down there, I placed the coffin down, giving Kilpatrick the stink eye. As best I could with button eyes. She was still uncomfortable looking at me and backed up when we placed the coffin down. Do I have to be here to watch? She asked, hugging herself and packing up away from the coffin. Creole walked over and grabbed the coffin, cracking it open and looking down into it, smiling as he saw the corpse in there. I walked over and peeked in. Yup. That was a dead child, all right. A rotting dead child at that. Thank God I can't smell things anymore. Well, you don't have to. But it will help with the ritual if you do. He chuckled, picking up the corpse and placing it on the same table he'd used to turn me into a puppet. Well, this sure was going to be fun to watch. Especially with the maggots crawling in and out of her body. It was obviously too much for Kilpatrick since she started gagging and throwing up. Yep. Super glad I can't smell or taste things anymore. Creole went to work, straightening the body out and nodding. He then looked over to me with a smile and beckoned me to come closer to him. I duly obeyed and walked over to him, leaning in so he could whisper to me. Bring that skin I had you place in my office, he said, pulling back and shooing me away. Welp, now I've been downgraded to errand boy. Sighing, I obeyed and made my way back up the stairs, picking up all the things he would need, the skin, threads, needles, etc. Making sure everything was in my arms, I made my way back downstairs, placing them on the table for my boss. He nodded happily at me and cracked his gloved fingers. One thing about Creole is that he is an expert at sewing. Be they dolls, or in this case humans. Must be all those years he did piano, because his fingers are like water, man. Smooth moving. If he wasn't keeping me trapped in here as his slave, I would strive to be this good. He laid the new skin on top of the rotting corpse and began to sew it to the old skin, humming a song as he did so. Clearly lost in his craft. Kilpatrick came over soon to see what was going on. She raised a brow at the skin, at obviously now being a match for her daughter, but that soon changed when the skin began to mold and form to the child's body, turning the correct shade and even growing back the red hair she had used to have. Creole stepped back and nodded at his work, looking around the basement for something before looking to Kilpatrick. Buttons or glass eyes? He asked of her, throwing her off and causing her to take a step back at that. Obviously, she'd never had to consider a question like that. Why can't you give her regular eyes? She asked. Well, those are hard to come by. Where glass and button eyes are far easier to use. I assure you, dear. Nobody will notice. Well, with a glass option, of course. He laughed with a smile. Kilpatrick wasn't amused, though by her look she was the kind of no-nonsense cop. Fine. Give her glass ones. She sighed, crossing her arms again, the gun on her holster moving a bit. I looked at it, but if the times the shop got robbed were any indication, there was no point in trying to kill Creole that way. With his answer, Creole reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 pairs of glass eyes. And carefully he placed them into the gaping holes where the girl's eyes used to be. She was young, she looked maybe 7 or 8. just about Olivia's age. I was wondering what had happened to her, but the gaping hole in her neck kinda said enough about that. Shot, it would seem. By who? I was soon about to find out the answer to that question. But for now, Creole dramatically dusted his hands off and stepped back. Now then, will her mother step forward and offer her blood? He asked, a nice smile on his face as usual. Kilpatrick walked over and looked at her daughter on the table. The softening of her face obviously showed that Creole had done an incredible job at making her look just like she had when she was alive. He looked at Creole and nodded as she offered her hand to him. He raised a needle up and pricked each of her fingers nice and deep. The crimson liquid dripped off of her fingers and into the girl's open mouth. It took a minute or two, but it was soon obvious that the body was starting to change drastically. Before, she'd resembled a wax figure doll. But with each drip into her mouth, she gained color and started breathing. Wow, he really can grant any wish. Although this being King Creole, I was expecting the inevitable. Sussy. The woman gasped when the little girl sat up from the table, breathing rapidly and looking down at her hands and arms, clutching her throat as she seemingly tried to stop the bleeding that had caused her untimely death. But she then looked up at her mother and blinked a couple of times. "Susie, it's mommy," she said, getting on her knees and grabbing her daughter and kissing her until a couple of minutes ago rotting face. Mommy," she said in a soft voice. Her arms soon came around and hugged the woman. It was a tender moment, which lasted all of 5 seconds. "Why did you kill me, mommy?" the little girl suddenly asked, causing me to raise my brow and look over at Creole, who was just smiling and chuckling up a storm as he backed away. I follow in his lead and backing up as well. "What?" Kilpatrick asked quickly, pushing the little girl away from her, still keeping her hands on her shoulders. Her face one of denial as she chuckled and looked around the basement. "What are you talking about, baby? I didn't do anything to you," she explained. But the girl looked straight on at her with her glass eyes. "I came downstairs while you and Daddy were fighting. You shot Daddy in front of me," the little girl said, her voice deadpan. "Sitting up more on the table and standing up on it. When I started crying, you shot me too," she said, holding an accusing finger up at her mother. "Why, you were supposed to be in bed," she said quickly, backing up into Creole, who chuckled as he clasped her shoulder from behind, smiling as he held her in place despite her attempts to shrug her off. I had to make it look like a robbery," she shouted, struggling against the unnatural strength of Creole. "You lied, mommy. You always said lying was bad," Susie said, her voice becoming more and more distorted, her mouth opening up to reveal row upon row of needle-like teeth inside of her mouth. "You killed me and lied," she shouted in a distorted voice, pouncing from the table and onto her mother, taking a big chunk of neck meat, sending mother and daughter down to the floor in a gargled scream. Creole stepped over the two of them as Sussy continued to chow down on her mother. "She never said to make her forget about what happened," he explained with a chuckle, tapping me on the shoulder and turning around to watch the scene with me. "Your parents seem really desperate to find you. Maybe they'll come in and wish for you back. Better hope they worded correctly." He giggled, slapping me hard on the back and leaving me alone to watch the scene as he returned upstairs. I stood there and watched a little girl eat her mother for a good while, mostly because I dreaded returning upstairs. I was about to until something came sliding over to me and hitting my nice dress shoes. I looked down and I swear I almost lost both of my button eyes. A pocket knife. I looked back over at Kilpatrick's body and saw Mary already going through the dead woman's pockets. "Keep it safe," she said, going back to looking for anything else. I bent over and picked it up, feeling the item in my hand and looking back over at Mary. I wanted to try cutting the ropes there, but I need another opportunity where Creole wasn't in the shop. Guess I just have to play the waiting game some more. Hopefully, I can stay sane long enough till that happens. Sussy finished eating her mother and came upstairs with me. Creole ended up turning her into a voodoo doll and placing her on the wall with the others. Why waste precious materials after all? It had turned out that Kilpatrick's husband and daughter were killed in a burglary gone wrong. And looks like Kilpatrick had a fat life insurance policy on her husband. So much for serving and protecting. Since the cops are firmly not an option anymore, I'm still stuck at the shop. But at least I have a knife now. Not risking telling you guys where it is, just know it's safe. And hopefully, I'll be able to do something with it. A small step towards freedom. But a step nonetheless.